afternoon. My name is Skye Perryman. I'm a lawyer and an advocate. I run an organization called Democracy Forward, and we were on the front lines of challenging the Trump administration and the prior administration, the unlawful policies, and now work across the country to address extremism in state and local communities, as well as looming federal threats. But today I'm here in my personal capacity as a citizen that is concerned about American democracy. And I wanted to set the stage this morning. We have three wonderful experts that I'm going to get to let you all hear from. But we'll set the stage this morning with a few facts, because we like facts and we're not afraid of facts and looking at the truth, which is that in 2021, the United States, for the first time, was designated a backsliding democracy. And this designation was an outlier in that we are the only Western advanced economy to be added or on that list. Last year, you probably saw that 13 presidential libraries from Hoover to Obama, so there's a lot of folks that disagree about a lot of things in those libraries, but all of them issued a warning on the state and the fragile state of American democracy. And then just this last week, we saw a sitting member of the US Supreme Court. We read a story about election denialism and a symbol of election denialism flying in a sitting member of the Supreme Court's yard. And so I think this is a good day for us to talk about authoritarianism and the weaponization of government and the threats that we are facing. I will say that all of those facts that I just recited are about the state of American democracy today. And yet we are in the midst of a year where there are other threats that are looming, a truly pivotal year. And so that's what we're going to focus on today, are understanding some of the threats from these wonderful experts and then talking about what can be done. And so I have the privilege of being here with Claire Finkelstein, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She has such a long resume, and we want to get to the conversation here, but she does lead the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, and I would encourage you to look the center up. She is an expert on democracy and national security and ethics. I'm also incredibly excited to be joined by Rotimi Adeoye, who is a columnist for the Daily Beast, a voting rights expert, a veteran of Capitol Hill, and also engaged in getting his legal education. So we're incredibly excited to have Rotimi here. And then, of course, last but not least, from POGO, the Project on Government Oversight, which is the sponsor of this panel, and we are so grateful to you all, Joe. Joe Spielberger, who does a lot of work to ensure that our government works for all people, and is a policy counsel at POGO in Washington, and also has a deep history in state-based advocacy as well. So very excited, and without further ado, I think we'll start with you, Rotimi, because of this election denialism, which we continue to not be able, it seems like, to get beyond, including from the news this week. Could you talk about, from your perspective, as someone that has studied voting rights and worked on behalf of voting rights and been in individual communities working on these issues, sort of what concerns you most about this moment and the rise of these authoritarian tendencies in the U.S.?
Definitely. Everyone hear me? We're good? Cool. I think one thing that stands out to me anytime we're talking about Trump and democracy is what he said when he announced his second term, which is I alone in the retribution. And I think that goes towards every single part of his candidacy. And one particular thing that stands out to me actually is a story. As a former election worker, her name was Ruby Freeman, and she was a volunteer election worker simply just trying to take part in democracy, trying to help her community. And the Donald Trump team created a ludicrous lie that she was filling ballots, that she was doing all these awful things. And the threats got so bad, she had to sell her home. She was living out of her car at one point, all because of the threats that Donald Trump and his team had carried out. And I think what that shows is that if he's elected again, not only will he be able to use kind of the loud and wild platform that he has, but having election officials and government officials chasing down people that are just volunteering in their community and using their government positions to really aggressively attack our democracy and individuals, people's lives, I think is a threat that we have seen in this election, but if it continues, it's only going to hurt our country more. And average Americans that are just trying to take part in their community are really going to feel the brunt of that.
Okay, so that's on the voting front. In communities, it's not just a headline national news story, it's affecting real people. And so, Claire, we know that the threat goes beyond voting and beyond election denialism, and one of the reasons I think the organizers wanted to focus on the weaponization of government is to sort of understand and focus on that threat. So can you talk a little bit about, from your expert perspective, what's at stake here?
And I just want to begin by asking the audience a question. How many of you were taught that democracy was safe because we had checks and balances? Just about everybody. And how many of you were taught that the two basic checks and balances for a runaway president were, number one, impeachment, and number two, the vote? Just about everyone, right. And those are supposed to be, I don't know if this mic is, yeah. And those are supposed to be the basic checks and balances of our system. But guess what? If we have a criminal president, a president who is willing to violate the law, then both impeachment and the vote can be undermined. So my question, I'm going to ask one more question, is how many of you still believe that impeachment and the vote serve as checks and balances on a runaway president in our democracy? Nobody. And that's the problem. And so what checks and balances really come down to now is the ability to hold a runaway president to account, to call him to account. And so I would say that the future of our democracy rests with the question of immunity. And it's not just the Supreme Court immunity case, it's de jure immunity, as we would call that, the Supreme Court coming down with the right decision in the immunity case, which I do believe they will, though I'm concerned about a somewhat watered-down immunity decision. And as some of you may know, I filed an amicus brief in that case with Richard Painter as my counsel of record, with 14 national security retired national security professionals, in which we tried to show that immunity would be disastrous for the chain of command. Most of those individuals were retired military, and tried to show that if the commander-in-chief is allowed to issue illegal orders, it would sow chaos into the chain of command. But also to show that a de facto illegality, de facto immunity in our system of government, as will happen if these trials fail, will mean that no president is ever held to the rule of law again. And that will destroy our democracy. So I literally think we hang by a thread. These trials, and we see right before our eyes that former President Trump is threatening judges, that people are intimidated, that it is very, very difficult for the justice system to function under these circumstances, very hard to enforce a gag order and everything that that means, that it is very hard to hold even a former president, let alone a current president, to account. And therein lies the grave peril for our democracy.
Okay, we've touched on election denialism, yes. The absence of checks and balances and the need for checks and balances. And then we're gonna zoom out a bit. And Joe, I'm gonna ask you to maybe talk a bit about the threat that has been posed by a document that has come out and what it represents, 900 pages, called Project 2025, where over now I think it's up to 100 extreme organizations have joined together to produce a plan to remake our American government. And in particular, I know you've been doing a lot of work on civil service and good government. And so if you could talk just briefly about the threat that you've talked to us about that you see posed by those issues.
We've been closely tracking all of the various efforts to dismantle and destroy the federal civil service. Of course, federal workers play such an essential role as a guardrail against authoritarianism. They are hired based on merit and for their qualifications, not to serve an individual president or to pursue a partisan political agenda. And they are also the best positioned and the first line of defense to speak out against abuse of power, against corruption, against other wrongdoing when they witness it. When we look back at the Trump administration, a big reason why we learned so much about the abuse of power and everything else that was happening was thanks to federal workers who became whistleblowers, who stood up and spoke out against what was happening, taking huge risks to themselves, their careers, their livelihoods in the process in order to do the right thing. And as we saw, President Trump became increasingly frustrated by these people who, in his mind, were standing in the way and not pledging their loyalty to him personally, and he wanted to get rid of them. So very late in the administration, towards the very end, he signed a new executive order referred to as Schedule F. Schedule F was a plan to destroy the federal government by reclassifying federal workers to strip them of their due process protections and make it easier for them to be fired. This would allow a president to purge the civil service of nonpartisan experts, people who serve with integrity, and pack every federal agency with partisan loyalists who would be willing to follow any order without question, regardless of how unlawful it might be. As one really brief example of this type of purge, one of the first agencies that went forward in implementing Schedule F was the Office of Management and Budget. They would have reclassified 88% of their workforce as Schedule F, stripping them of their protections. They went first because the administration wanted them to set an example for other agencies to follow. So we can only imagine, had the Schedule F policy been fully implemented and had other agencies followed their lead, now all of a sudden we're talking about 88% of people in every single federal agency. This would inevitably lead to direct harms against people and communities all across this country, and it is a foundational element of an authoritarian agenda, because after you sideline all of these people, which can be done through mass firings, it can also be done simply by stripping them of their protections, chilling First Amendment free speech rights, chilling dissent, and creating and perpetuating a climate of fear and intimidation. There is nobody left who is able and willing to speak out and prevent a true authoritarian takeover of our federal government.
Okay, so, thank you. All right, we're clapping for the threats here, but we need to talk about the solutions. And so this was not just to be doom and gloom, although there is a lot of reasons to be incredibly concerned just based on the title of this panel, The Rise of Authoritarianism in the United States. Claire, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to be mindful of time because we're going to do like 2 more rounds, and we want to sort of leave some minutes. So just quickly, I think, what can be done now? I've heard you talk about that there are some things actually that can be done now. And so maybe reviewing a bit of those, in this perilous moment.
Yeah. While we're busy trying to defeat Trump, I think we really need to put a lot of energy into preparing for the possibility that he will be reelected. And we really have to stare that hard in the face. We didn't do that in 2016. Nobody actually believed that he was going to get elected, and we have to get ready for that. And I think the Biden administration, it's a very difficult position to be in because, of course, they don't want to plan for their own demise, but they need to get ready for the possibility that so many of the vulnerable points in our democracy will be used as a lever for authoritarianism. And the Justice Department comes top of mind. So the first thing that we're going to see, day one of a new Trump administration, if any of the trials are still going on, is Jack Smith will be fired. Now, Democrats, interestingly, have been against bringing back the special counsel law. Because they don't like the way it was used against Bill Clinton. But let's look at that, right? Are we sure? Everybody's worried about, special counsels, But are we sure that we don't want to imbue our special counsels with greater independence? Because it might be the only hope that we have. Are we sure that we don't want to imbue our Justice Department with greater independence? That can be a two-way sword. I've been looking a lot at the Insurrection Act, and there were calls for law reform around the Insurrection Act, which, as many of you may realize, can be weaponized against dissent. We saw something like that in Lafayette Park. And systematically going through all of the things that happened in Trump 1.0, getting ready for Trump 2.0, let's remember that delicate meeting that happened in the White House when Trump was seriously discussing having the Army seize voting machines to redo the election, right? That is a chain of command issue first and foremost, because we need to make sure that our military is prepared to refuse unlawful orders, right? So one of the things that we've been looking at is military training and trying to shore up our military around the idea that you may have to get prepared for getting illegal orders to deploy against civilians. And what are you going to do when that happens? So there are a lot of points. Another point I'll mention is there were 3 Justice Department memos saying you can't indict a sitting president. If the trials are still going on, I guarantee you those will be used to say, and that means you have to shut down trials against a president that comes in with indictments. I think arguably that's a different matter. The Biden administration should be issuing a memo right now that says, guess what, that principle that you can't indict a sitting president, that doesn't apply when you already come in with an indictment. There are many, many points on which I think we can be preparing for a Trump 2.0.
And Rotimi, can you talk about can you talk about other sort of preparations around voting? I mean, is there a role for Congress here? What can people do? And we'll do have another round sort of on individual people. So I think more systemically, like what could be done now on voting and voter protection? I
think looking at Congress, one of the things that has personally frustrated me as someone that pays a lot of attention to voting rights, I was at the ACLU kind of spearheading a project on this, is getting Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It is incredible that at this state in our democracy, we don't have a Voting Rights Act. We don't. This was signed by Reagan. It was re-signed by Bush. It was signed by countless Republican presidents, and it hasn't been reauthorized. And it's an embarrassment to our country that the voting, a fundamental part of how our country is created, has been constantly pushed back by the court system, and Congress refuses to put a system in place that we've said has worked for so many years and has made our country stronger and made voting easier. So I think that's a big systemic thing we need to do, is reauthorize the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I also think another thing we need to do is, which I am happy to see the Biden administration is being very aggressive about this, is making sure we have federal judges, confirming federal judges and making sure they are there. So when these cases are coming through the federal courts, we have people that are thinking about the Constitution in a way that is focused on making sure America is really growing into the 21st century, and making sure that democracy is expanding. So I would say making sure we're reauthorizing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and then also making sure we have federal judges in place.
I'm going to ask you about the protection of civil service, and Kim's going to bring our water. Thank you. I got a little dust in my throat. But yeah, the protection of civil service. What can we do there?
Yeah, so fortunately we have seen a little bit of progress or traction on this issue recently. The Biden administration recently issued a new rule which offers some additional protections for civil servants, but this is realistically only likely to delay the re-implementation of Schedule F by a matter of months, if that. What we really need is for Congress to legislate, but I want to really break down why this is so important, because when we talk about fighting Schedule F, yes, we want federal workers to have the rights and protections that they've earned, but but we are much more concerned about protecting the public from a fully politicized and weaponized civil service. Federal workers, of course, play essential roles in providing all of the services and benefits that we rely on. They live and work in every state across the country. They are out there providing disaster relief. They are administering Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other benefit programs. They're researching infectious diseases. They are monitoring the safety of the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. I think everyone in this audience would agree that we deserve a federal government that works for us, that serves us fairly and effectively, regardless of who we are, where we live, or how we vote. All of the rights, protections, services, and benefits that we rely on to live our lives could be at risk under Schedule F. For example, if you are a senior citizen who receives Social Security, it's possible that those benefits could be withheld or delayed if you happen to live in a red state or a blue state. If your home is at risk for a natural disaster, that federal relief that you need could be upheld. If a president perceives you or people in your community as political enemies, they could order the IRS to audit you. They could order the Justice Department to investigate and prosecute you. They could find opportunities to send the military into your neighborhoods and communities. This is likely to be felt by people in very personal ways. And the last thing that I'll say on this is that they could get away with all of this because they will have packed every federal agency with partisan loyalists, again, who will be willing to carry out any order, regardless of how illegal it might be.
And so there are things to be done, just really quickly on that. Are there things that can be done now on that? Yeah, oh, you're gonna do that at the end. Okay, great, that's fine, okay. So we have just a few minutes, and one of the things we know, and I think I see so many familiar faces that you all know, when we have studied and looked at democracies throughout history, is that when they backslide, and when they decline, and when they die, it is often because by the time that everyone becomes aware of the threats and the harms, it's too late. That's what we know. And so my last question is, for all of you, is it too late? And if it is not too late, what do you want everyone here to know about what can be done in this moment to advance our democracy?
So it's never too late. Even when you're in full-blown authoritarianism, it's not too late. Right, we have seen an authoritarian government in Poland that came back really from the brink. We of course can fight for democracy, and we must. And we've been talking, of course, about the fear of a Trump 2.0. But I want to also mention that it's also never too late for democracy to be in danger. So we need not to be complacent, even if Trump loses in November. Let's not forget January 6th, okay? It could be that the next January 6th makes the last January 6th look like child's play. So we need to be vigilant. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about is that we play too much for the short term. And we don't play a long-term game. So I wrote an op-ed during the first effort to impeach Donald Trump that criticizing the Democratic strategy because they were in a hurry to get it done before the election. And I actually thought a better strategy, because the most important thing was that Congress had the ability to enforce its subpoenas. We find Congress has actually a great deal of difficulty with that, right? And that those inquiries had to be protected. And I thought that going after members of the Trump administration, hauling them in and being able to ask them questions was critical so that Bill Barr couldn't keep promising to come in and talk to Congress and not doing it, right? So we need to, that's just one of many examples where I think we need to play a long game. So I'll give you one other example, is federalism. We need to be extremely focused on the independent authority of governors. Now, each of these things is a double-edged sword. everybody will have in mind examples where it can go the wrong way and where we can have governors that can flip the approach to democratic governance and the rule of law. But ultimately, if you believe in a system not only of horizontal checks and balances, but vertical checks and balances, which I think is the wisdom of our original system, we need to protect independence at all levels and be prepared, as I say, to fight that long game for the fundamental checks and balances of our democracy.
Thank you. All right, I know what you're going to say, but is it too late? And if not, what can be done?
Definitely not too late. I wouldn't be here if I thought it was too late. You know, I'd be doing something else. But on a more serious note, I think, you know, something that always has stood out to me about the American story is it is always 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. I mean, you know, I'm really interested in American history. I've been reading a lot about Reconstruction, and something that stands out to me about that time is that when Reconstruction ended, there were still so many people in the country that wanted to, you know, create the America post-Civil War that so many people wanted to see, and they kept doing that. And that's where, you know, you have the abolition movement slowly over time then turned to the civil rights movement in the 60s. And, you know, if those people gave up, we wouldn't have people like MLK, we wouldn't have folks like John Lewis, we wouldn't have Fannie Lou Hamer, all these great voting rights activists that stood up to fix and make our country stronger. So I think, you know, speaking on a more practical level, I think one thing obviously you got to do is get registered to vote. You got to get your friends registered to vote, and then also got to make sure you're working as an election worker. I don't know if you've seen, Laura Trump is recruiting election workers across the country. And you know, I haven't met everyone in this room, but I can tell you that I know everyone in this room would be 10 times better than the folks that she's recruiting. So I think I would tell everyone here is get registered to vote and then make sure you're going out and work as an election worker, because we need people that are going to be making sure, you know, the gears and the nuts and bolts of our democracy are running smoothly. So that's what I think we all should do.
All right, Joe, is it too late? And what should we do?
It's certainly not too late, and when it comes to Schedule F, we will continue to sound the alarm as we've done for years. What we really need people to understand is what Schedule F is, why it's important, and how it's likely to impact you, your families, your communities, and people you care about. Talk to people you know, talk to your elected representatives, because at the end of the day, again, Congress needs to legislate, and so what we really need is a bipartisan commitment across the political aisle of lawmakers in Congress to commit to maintaining the nonpartisan expertise of the federal civil service as a core tenet of protecting our democracy.
Thank you all for joining. As a point of privilege, I'll just say, I mean, everyone on this stage, you guys are doing amazing work. So you have their names and the centers and institutions that they're from. Please follow that work. And it's been wonderful to be here with you all today. I think there'll be some time to talk on some of the breaks and to see all of you. But thank you for your commitment to democracy. We don't think it's too late. None of us would be here. And I think that, you know, this is such a special place to be holding this. And of course, if people that came before us thought that it was too late or that the odds were too tough, we wouldn't be here today. And so I think that that's how we'll leave this pretty daunting panel, if I must say so myself. But thank you all for your commitment to democracy.